Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, Gov Law Unit 4, Video 1. Let's start by talking about diplomacy. What is diplomacy? Diplomacy is a complicated process that allows each nation to work together to maintain relationships with other countries or other nations. For example, the United States has a very long and complicated history with many Middle Eastern nations, including Iran. This political cartoon depicts President Obama as a Wild West, quick-to-draw figure in his relationship or diplomatic ties with Iran. The things that are on the table are sanctions and embargoes, which we know from economics and history are significant trade barriers put in place when countries don't relate well to one another, or finally, the bomb represents war. The United States and Iran have a complicated diplomatic relationship that stems way back from post-World War II. There's been CIA-involved coups, there's been overthrows of the military, and the current administration in Iran, led by President Ahmadinejad, is not supportive of the Obama administration, and relations have been tense since Iran has committed itself to developing a nuclear program. So to maintain a working relationship with the country of Iran, because it is in the Middle East and located close to many of our ally nations, the United States needs to take several diplomatic moves in order to maintain the relationship with Iran. Another example of diplomacy, the process by which states carry on political relations with one another, is our relationship with North Korea. Our relationship with North Korea also goes back to the 1950s, and it is fairly complicated. The Kim family, now led by Kim Jong-un, lead North Korea, and North Korea has also developed nuclear technology, which threatens our allies, most notably South Korea and Japan, in the East Asian area. This American political cartoonist depicts Kim Jong-un, who's relatively young and inexperienced, as a boy with his toy being a nuclear weapon. So as you can see, the United States has a complicated diplomatic relationship with several countries around the world, which make us more vulnerable to issues throughout the world. So how does diplomacy work? Diplomacy works through what we call foreign policy. Every country has a general idea of how they want to relate to another country. Do we want to have positive ties, negative ties, neutral, or somewhere in between, those three categories? So foreign policy are the actions, words, and beliefs toward another country. And foreign policy is really a nation's external goals and the techniques and strategies used to achieve them. So in the United States diplomatic relations with Iran, they have the option of sanctioning, embargoing, or going to war. Those would all be foreign policy options. So whereas diplomacy is the overall process, policy is the trajectory of that actual process. So the question is, how do we create goals for foreign policy? Well, goals for foreign policy are fairly broad. They protect the nation and the citizens, whether it's the United States, the United Kingdom, or any other nation in the world. Another goal of foreign policy is to support economic growth at home and abroad. So let's say, for example, Costa Rica, and they want to promote their banana and coffee production. They would use foreign policy tools to support that economic growth at home and abroad. Also, nations try to work in their support of human rights. That's against slavery, rights of women, right against child labor, etc., into their foreign policy. And specifically in the United States, we try to increase support abroad for American ideals. Freedom and democracy are two very important American values, which we try to promote abroad. The foreign policy process is somewhat complicated. That's the steps by which foreign policy goals are decided upon and acted upon. So the question now lies in who creates foreign policy. In looking at foreign policy, one of the biggest creators of foreign policy is the Secretary of State, as you can see here, John Kerry, former senator and former presidential candidate, now serves as Obama's Secretary of State. The job of the Secretary of State, as the head of the Department of State, is to represent the United States' diplomatic and foreign policy interests abroad. So working very closely with the President, the Secretary of State travels throughout the entire world creating or implementing our foreign policy goals with countries anywhere from Iran, North Korea, to France, whatever, and they have to work within congressional approval. Remember, Congress controls the money, so in order for the President and the Secretary of State to achieve foreign policy goals, they must also work with Congress. So through diplomacy, that includes all of the nation's external relationships, from routine diplomatic communications to summit meetings among heads of states, diplomacy implements our foreign policy. Our foreign policy could include things like our national security policy, which is designed, of course, to protect the independence and political integrity of the United States, and our defense policy, which is really just a subset of national security policy. As the creators of foreign policy, there are certain goals. For example, if our national goal is to achieve stability in the Middle East, because we need Middle Eastern oil, and to encourage the formation of pro-American governments there, like we have in Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. foreign policy in that area must be carried out through diplomacy, but also it must provide economic aid, technical assistance, and sometimes military intervention. So let's look at foreign aid. Foreign aid is just what you assume it to be, the assistance a country provides to another. The goal, of course, is to create allies and foster trade relationships. The aid can be an economic aid, so providing money, maybe providing implementation of water purification. Military aid, that's providing military advisors, or just an advising ship on how to create a road system or how to better your telecommunication system. So the United States provides foreign aid to several countries around the world in forms of economic, military, and advising aid. So let's take a look at economic aid. Economic aid, we can look at the area of the Middle East. Specifically, we can take a look at Syria and Israel, which are located, of course, very closely to Saudi Arabia, who is a major ally for the United States, as well as Iraq, where we have been fighting a war for several years, and very close to Egypt, which has been in upheaval in the few recent years. Israel receives approximately $3 billion per year in United States economic aid. Its country is the largest recipient of aid since World War II, and the U.S. financial aid is provided to other countries. However, Israel has been our biggest support of economic aid since World War II, as we helped create that nation after the end of World War II aggressions. You might be wondering why the United States provides such a large amount of aid to Israel every year. Well, unfortunately, the answer is not a simple one. However, you have to take into consideration that Israel was essentially carved out of several other nations in very recent history, which has led to instability of the entire region, considering the fact that the area around Jerusalem is where three separate religions claim holy territory, whether that be the Muslims or the Christians or people of Jewish descent. So that area has been largely very unstable since the end of World War II, needing a lot of economic aid, most of that coming from the United States. As Israel is a very important ally to the United States, we provide a lot of economic aid. Military aid is also another form of aid which is provided to achieve our foreign policy goals. So if our foreign policy goal is to provide stability or prevent instability in the Middle East, another form of aid we need to provide is military aid, and that's sometimes to prevent war and protect the interests of the United States. Military aid involves all four branches of the United States military. And let's take an example like the country of Kuwait. Kuwait is a very small island nation, a very small nation located next to Iraq and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a major U.S. ally and has been for several decades, and Saudi Arabia is where a lot of American oil comes from. The country of Iraq has a long and complicated history, but their leader, prior to his removal in recent years by the Bush administration, Saddam Hussein ruled the country, and seeking more access to the ocean, Iraq invaded Kuwait, which is a small independent nation, in the early 1990s. The United States responded with the first Gulf War by invading Iraq to push the Iraqi soldiers back out of Kuwait. So the U.S. provides military aid to the region, even though Kuwait might not be an important trading ally. Saudi Arabia is, and providing stability in the Middle East is very important at a foreign policy goal for the United States of America. In order to achieve foreign policy goals, the United States, through the Secretary of State, the President, and other leaders, sometimes approve treaties or promote treaties between different parties, including the United States, to improve diplomatic relationships between other countries. This picture shows former President Jimmy Carter here with the leaders of Israel and Egypt in 1978, brokering peace between Egypt and Israel after a long and bloody war that led to a lot of instability in the Middle Eastern region. Treaties are formal agreements between countries. They do carry the weight of law between those countries. However, each country has to uphold them on their own. It is negotiated by the Secretary of State, so whomever the President appoints to his cabinet, the Secretary of State, typically negotiates the treaty. However, it does require the President to sign it, and the Senate must approve all treaties with a 2/3 majority vote. So it must be, these diplomatic relationships must be approved by congressional leaders. So treaties, economic aid, military assistance really sum up the whole of basics of diplomacy and foreign policy. The United States has a long and complicated history of diplomacy and foreign policy goals throughout the world. If we think about how our country first started in relationship to Great Britain to our current relationships with Middle Eastern countries, it is very complicated and complex. Those who have been our enemies are now our allies, and vice versa. So, U.S. foreign policy changes on a very frequent basis based on what's happening in the current world.